And now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Catherine Daniels. She's somewhere here. Catherine, where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay. Catherine has worked for, so Dr. Daniels has worked for Washington State University since 1990 in a number of jobs related to pesticide information, collection, and dissemination. And prior to that, she received a master's in genetics from the University of Arizona and her PhDs in genetics and cell biology from Washington State University. And she's a cell biologist by training, but a chance hallway conversation with a postdoc, during a postdoc, led her into the complicated world of pesticide labels away from cell biology and genetics. So today she's here to talk about conversations along the Pacific Coast. And Catherine currently serves as the Washington State University's pesticide coordinator, which entails review and approval of all pesticide recommendations aimed at end users, like you. Catherine also manages an information center on pesticide use and policy. One of the key components of this center is a pesticide information center online that's a searchable database that contains all of the registered pesticide labels in Washington and Oregon. The center is located at the Washington State University, Puyallup, am I saying it right? Puyallup, okay. Research and Extension Center, which is roughly 30 miles south of Seattle, Washington. Two of the IPM projects that Catherine has recently been involved with includes the Pacific Northwest Ag Work Group and the Regional Information Coordinator, both funded by the Western Region IPM, Integrated Pest Management Center. And the Pacific Northwest Ag Work Group project brought the pesticide coordinators of 6 Western states together over a period of 5 years to brainstorm ideas on IPM implementation and cropping systems. One of the products of that brainstorming was creation of the Regional Information Coordinator, a person who answers EPA queries on what pests are important and how pesticides are used in all 6 states, thereby cutting down on duplication and streamlining response times. And today, Catherine is going to talk to us about urban horticulture and pest management, how we articulate philosophy with practices. Thank you, Catherine.
Okay, so sometimes I manage an indoor voice and sometimes I manage an outdoor voice. So what I need you to do is raise your hand or shout out if I'm resorting to my indoor voice and you can't hear me. And I need to change my glasses. I've reached that unfortunate stage when I need 3 different ones. But I've gone into denial and I'm only restricting myself to 2. So the third one is this kind of a thing. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me here. This is a beautiful place. My folks are from Hutchinson, and so that's pretty much my reference point for Kansas. And you'll have to tell me whether that's a faux pas or not, whether this is maybe the representative place for Kansas. Anyway, I have fond memories of it. The people are very friendly and nice, and when you come in the winter, you don't have to worry about tornadoes. So I'm going to be talking about IPM and urban horticulture, which really could fill an entire semester's worth of course material. So what I'm going to do is just focus on one part of the country, which is the Pacific Northwest. Let's see if I can get this. Okay. So the first thing I like to do in a course presentation is to tell people if you have questions, if you're shy, raise your hand, and if you're not, then just shout out your question, because I work in extension. We're a highly interactive group, and I like that discourse between people. So we're not in a formal classroom. Feel free to just tell me if I wasn't clear or you have a follow-up question. So what I want to do first is start with an outline to tell you where we're headed in this conversation. And the first thing we need to do is do a quick review of the IPM philosophy and principles. I know that that's a strong part of the coursework here, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I think it's good to go over definitions. I'll tell you a little bit about the Pacific Northwest, which we just refer to as the PNW. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the practices, the IPM practices that we do there, some that work and some that maybe could use some improvement. some of the challenges that I've identified, as well as the opportunities, and then I want to have a discussion with you to hear your observations and comments. Maybe you've got some ideas about challenges that we haven't seen or can't predict, being too close to the situation, and also some opportunities that you think we might have, either based on your experience or just a plain old good idea. So we're going to launch into philosophy. Urban IPM has as many different definitions as you have people. It's one of those highly personal things, which I think is kind of ironic because the whole purpose of IPM is to be situational, very specific to the situation that you're in. So what I've done is select the definition from USDA NIFA, which houses the National IPM program, because I think it's a pretty good one. And what their definition is implementation of diverse methods of pest control. And you pair that with monitoring for the purpose of reducing unnecessary pesticide applications. You do use pesticides in combination with these other management practices to minimize the effects of pests and also to support your profitable system, but also making sure you have negligible negative effects. And because urban IPM often takes place around structures, what I would do is amend this, pardon me, I'm still getting used to this. I would amend this crop thing to say crop or site. And then the profitable part of it, I would amend to say profitable and healthy. And when you put that part in there, it becomes a little more friendly towards urban IPM. Because really, it's hard to quantify the profitability of urban IPM. But you can talk about the improved lifestyle, the healthier lifestyle aspects of it. So this is the definition that we're going to go through with the rest of the presentation. So how about the principles? A quick review of the 6 components, the 6 main components of IPM. The first one, might seem a little tongue-in-cheek to you or like I'm being a little sarcastic, but actually it's just as serious as the other 5. And the reason for that is the goal is never to eradicate the pest. The goal is to keep the population at levels that don't impact the economics of the plant production or the protection of human health, environmental health. So the goal isn't annihilation. And for people who have that, get rid of every pest, you sometimes have to adjust their attitude. Okay, so some examples of preventative cultural practices would include using resistant varieties, actively maintaining the plant health. If you're a regulatory agency, you would impose some plant quarantines, either keeping material from coming in, you're hoping, or if you've got it in, keeping it very tightly held in one space. You have to be mindful of your crop sanitation, follow your proper planting techniques, watering schedule to prevent plant stresses, that sort of thing. Okay, so moving on to pest monitoring, that includes both properly identifying the pest, so actually what you do is going to be targeted to the right pest. And it also includes inspecting the plant for signs or symptoms of disease or insect presence. And as boring as it sounds, it also includes record keeping, because sometimes you can't tell until several years into something exactly what's going on. What is the ebb and flow of that environmental area? And the best way that you can track that is by record keeping. It also helps if you have some movement of people in your job area, so that if you've got one person that's got all the institutional knowledge and they retire or they go off, there goes all of the information. Better to have it in some kind of a record form. You have to know the pest life cycles, because how else are you going to identify the vulnerable points? Nobody wants to be attacking the pest when it's at its strongest. You waste too much time and energy for that. On mechanical pest controls, some examples would include tillage, that's basically for weeds, some hand picking if you've got insects large enough to do that, or maybe pluck off a few infested leaves, and then also implementing various barriers or physical barriers or traps. Some of the biological controls would include using beneficial insects that will either directly eat a pest or will parasitize it by placing an egg in the pest. It'll include microorganisms like Bacillus thuringiensis or entomopathogenic nematodes or fungi. And responsible use of pesticides is also something that could cover an entire course. So I'm just going to skim the surface of that and tell you that responsible use of pesticides basically means you're using the right active ingredient for the pest and environment combination in the right formulation for the crop or the site during the right environmental conditions, and that way the material will stay put and it will work. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly is the Pacific Northwest. And the term usually means Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Once in a while, we'll sneak in Alaska just in kind of a friendly way. But for this particular talk, I'm just going to focus on the three of these. And that's just because I don't know anything about urban horticulture in Alaska. So we'll take the big picture first with the U.S. You're roughly about right there in the middle of the country. And we're clear up at the top northwestern end of things. So, and I apologize for these being kind of fuzzy. It's just the way they came off of the web. So if you take this little slice off the end of the country, you'll see that this is Washington, this is Oregon, and I've got most of Idaho. Some of it's missing right here. This is Vancouver Island, Canada, etc. So the part that I wanted you to see on this slide is that we have quite a few mountainous regions. So we've got the Olympic Mountains, the coastal mountains over here. You've got the Cascade Mountains that run all the way down from British Columbia through the bottom of Oregon. And then this part of the mountains in Idaho are continuations of the Rocky Mountains. So we've got a lot of mountains, and then we've also got high desert here in all three of the Pacific Northwest states. And these areas of high desert, although we've got cities with urban horticulture, there are small cities. The urban horticulture is fairly small. And these are mainly cropping systems. So these, with the satellite images over here, are close-ups of the Seattle corridor metro area, the Portland metro area, and we're focusing on Seattle and Portland as our examples, not because they're completely representative of the entire region. I've already told you we've got cropping systems, and then we've got Seattle, highly urbanized. But these are the two powerhouse regions of the three states, and that's economically, voter concentration, and by overall population. So Seattle is 12th when you look at the gross domestic product of a metro area, 12th in the country. It has the 8th largest port in the US for container handling. Portland ranks 20 out of all of the US cities based on its gross domestic product by metro area. So these are really huge economic engines. The Seattle, Bellevue, Tacoma metro area has half of our state's population. So if you can imagine the entire state of Washington, we've got half of them in this area right there. And that's basically 3.5 million people. So in Portland, they're 57% of their state's population, and they're 2.9 million. So let me show you in a little more detail of what we're looking at. Seattle is right there. That's it, just right there. The Seattle metro area goes from here down to here. That's where you've got the 3.5 million people. This is the Columbia River, which is the natural dividing line between Washington and Oregon. This is Portland. This is the Portland metro area. Again, 57% of the population of that state lives in that area. So let's talk a little bit about the topography of the area. So it influences everything there, but especially urban horticulture and pest management. So what we refer to as the Puget Sound, and that's a nautical term, this is the Puget Sound, all of this waterway here. What you're looking at is the tip of Vancouver Island. The Pacific Ocean is out here, Strait of Juan de Fuca. Water comes in right here from the ocean and then distributes itself all the way, and that's Hood Canal, all the way around in here. Again, this is Seattle right there. So this is basically a fjord system, just like in Norway, where you have a very narrow inlet, and then you have steep-sided mountains. They're basically flooded valleys. So if you can imagine that this is the Olympic Mountains, these are the Cascade Mountains, this white spot right there is Mount Rainier. Everything comes as a V down into the Sound. So it's a natural drainage for all of these mountains. Everything that gets in water goes down to the Sound. Way back in the old days, before many of you were born, there was a saying that said, the solution to pollution is dilution. That was before we knew better. Because you just assume that if concentration is what causes effects, then you dilute it and you don't have those effects. Well, the situation here is that the volume of water in the Sound in this area is about 26.5 cubic miles of water. The problem is the tidal flow is only 1.26 cubic miles. So when you have material come into the Sound, it stays there. So you end up concentrating things. Also, when you've got sediment buildup and you've got the usual food chain starting at the bottom, you end up concentrating it as you go up to the top of the food chain. So when you look at Portland, all right, what happened to Portland? Portland, I'm going back to Portland over here. Portland is at the confluence of the Columbia and the Willamette. So they're actually quite a bit distant from the ocean, so they don't have the same tidal flow. But this whole area is all hydrologically connected. All of the streams are connected with groundwater. Sometimes you dig down 10 feet and you've hit groundwater. So that means that they have just as much concern for water quality as we do, even though they have different topography. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the horticulture end of things here. What are our growing conditions? We're both Portland and Seattle are considered temperate marine climates. Seattle's a little bit cooler in the summertime. Its usual high is around 75. Portland's is usually around 80. Portland gets a little bit colder in the wintertime, a few more freezing days than Seattle does. Seattle gets 37 inches per year of precipitation, and half of that falls in 3 months, November, December, and January. Portland is a little more spread out throughout the year. So if you happen to like filtered sunshine, that's what we call it in Seattle, filtered sunshine, then Seattle is exactly your kind of place, because out of 352 days of the year, 201 are usually completely cloudy and 93 are partly cloudy. And if you ever drive through the area and there's sunshine, people will tell you about that on the radio. We're having sunshine pressure on I-5. That means traffic slows down because we can see things now. Look at that. That's Mount Rainier. Oh my gosh, it's daylight. It's wonderful. We have sunshine pressure when we drive. Okay. So because of the topography, we have lots and lots and lots of microclimates. So that makes it challenging to do some things, but also pretty interesting from the horticulture end, because you can grow a lot of stuff in that area. So what happens from the weather standpoint is that you've got storms coming in on the coast. The coastal mountains will cause a split in the air. It'll go around the mountains and then meet in the convergence zone in Seattle. So what happens is, if you are on the coast, which would be just about there, in the Hoh rainforest, you will have 142 inches of rain per year. Then you've got the rain shadow from the Olympic Mountains, and Seattle gets 37 inches per year. And then if you go over to the border with Idaho right there, so that's about 279 miles east of Seattle, you'll be in Spokane, which is another metro area, much smaller though, and you'll have 16.5 inches of rain per year. So we've got an incredible range of population and also rain in our state. And Oregon is exactly the same way, because they have the same coastal mountain range, and then also the high desert in this area. So if you're looking at the hardiness zone map, you can see that the reason Idaho is lower is because part of the Rocky Mountains extends up into their state. Whereas we have, Washington and Oregon have more of a tempering effect from the ocean, so our zones are between 4 and 9. So I think it's interesting to consider, what is it about a sense of place, the demography, the geography, what is it about place that affects people's thinking about sustainability? And I'm using the term sustainability pretty narrowly, only in the sense of IPM, not, I mean, there's an incredible other range that you can include, but we're just going to do the sustainability in terms of IPM. So here's an aerial shot of downtown Seattle, and here's an aerial shot of downtown Portland. That's the Willamette River. So looking at some of the attitudes that people have in the Pacific Northwest, in some areas you have trouble getting people to adjust to the idea of a few chewed leaves or their plants not looking so well because of pests. That is not the problem in Portland and Seattle. They have a big focus on preventing harm to humans and salmon. Salmon is the indicator species for this part of the country. The fish in this picture is a sockeye salmon. They are, the eggs hatch in gravel beds, fresh water. They migrate to the ocean for a couple of years. When they're ready to spawn, they come back into fresh water and they turn that very distinctive red. Fish are a big part of the region because we have a number of tribal treaties. Also, they're a big push for tourism and also just plain old interest among folks who like fishing in the state. So they're used as an indicator species. Most of the storm drains have a little stencil on them that have an outline of a fish, and it says, "Dump no waste, drains to stream." Certification of some kind of environmental sustainability is big in these areas. People are always looking for a logo. The nurseries have jumped on that. This is a picture off of the Monrovia site. You may not know this, but the #1 agricultural export for Oregon, the entire state, is nursery. That is what their entire state is known for. Lots and lots and lots of nursery production, as well as turf, usually in the form of seed, so that they're selling the seed to other places where people are then growing the turf. Okay, so everybody is looking for some kind of an environmental logo, whether it also includes fair labor practices or not. They're looking for whether things are organic or chemical-free. We've also got quite the spectrum of values. This particular lady beetle sign is given away free from the Washington Toxics Coalition. It's an advocacy group. There are a number of advocacy groups in the PNW, and so you put that next to your roadside if you don't want the county or local area to be spraying for weeds. So basically, we've got no spray all the way to neighborhoods where there's covenants that require well-kept lawns. So basically, when you're practicing IPM as a landscaper, you have just the same kind of microclimates, political climates that you have to be worried about. How about some of the cultural practices? This particular photo is of a Sitka columbine, which attracts the western tiger swallowtail butterflies. So this is an example of some of the native plants that are promoted, and these are called ecological service gardens. It's not just the natives, though, that people are promoting. There's still a tremendous amount of energy behind non-native ornamentals that are going to feed birds, bees, and other pollinators. Also a lot of energy behind planting rain gardens. And as you can see in some areas of even our state, a rain garden is going to be more useful than others. Maybe not over in the Spokane area, certainly appropriate over in the coastal regions. So this is a poster promoting a rain garden event in Puyallup, the town that my work is located in. They're trying to get people to volunteer. Would you like to have a rain garden established in your lawn? And these are made to capture rainwater, stormwater that comes off of roofs, driveways, and landscape areas so that we would decrease flooding and also possibly hold contaminants in place, either because you've planted material that is able to absorb contaminants and hold it within the plant, or because you're trying to keep the sediments right there in that spot so that as the ground filters the water and the water enters the water table, it will have basically gone through a purifying effect. Like many of the states around the country, we have a very strong Master Gardener program, and they have plant clinics where people can bring material as well as ask questions and get educational material about how to take care of their plants. And although it's more likely to be used by the professionals than the homeowners, my university, Washington State, has a series of weather stations around the state that will provide you with local weather data as well as a web-based program that you can do irrigation scheduling. So let's talk a little bit about some of the pest monitoring that's done. All 3 states have noxious weed boards that monitor populations. So just looking at Oregon, for example, over the last 2 years, they've treated 1,200 sites. This would be integrated vegetation management. And they've also released biocontrols at over 120 different sites. What you're looking at here is a brushhead that feeds on Scotch broom. Honestly, Scotch broom is quite gorgeous when it's blooming. It's beautiful yellow. Sometimes we get little variations of orange. The problem is that it grows very thickly, and when it produces seed pods, they dehisce and spread seeds everywhere. You can literally hear the popping noises as you're walking down the pathways and the sun is out and the temperature is right. Pop hiss. And so they end up becoming these large monocultures, particularly along the roadways. Oregon also has a web-based mapping program. The little red spots you're looking at there are sightings of rue. They also have, both states monitor nurseries for sudden oak death. I don't know if that's a problem here. It's caused by Phytophthora ramorum. I should hope you never have to come across it. It is an incredibly it has an incredibly wide host range. And we're concerned because if it manages to establish itself in the state, we lose over 100 different species of plants, including those that populate our forests, as well as all of our nurseries. So this is a big monitoring effort. So what I've talked about so far has been, pretty much regulatory things when you're doing pest monitoring. But interestingly enough, one of our master gardeners found the red lily leaf beetle, I don't know, about 20 miles away from where I live in Bellevue, several years ago, reported that to the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And when we started looking into it, we found that probably 20% of the material in the last 10 years has been from master gardeners and interested homeowners, where we found something that the Department of Ag hasn't yet found. So WSU put a pest sightings listserv together, and that's one way that we can notify folks when we find things, as well as one plant clinic in the south may say, hey, we've started seeing aphids, or we've started seeing leaf miners. And then the county north to them will realize, okay, the migration has started. We can expect our plant clinic to be seeing these sorts of things. How about mechanical controls? Well, this is the one where we run the gamut from pretty successful to kind of futile. Tagro, there's their little logo. That's a very fancy name for material that's made from biosolids from the Tacoma wastewater plant. Do you all know what biosolids are? Okay. It turns out that, once people kind of wrap their head around that this is a really popular product sold by the bag or the truckload, and they advertise this as a nutrient-rich blend of 20% biosolids, 20% maple sawdust, and 60% clean aged bark. So this is one of our successes in terms of mulches. People are very fond of using mulches for weed control as well as water retention, because remember that half of our rainfall comes in the wintertime. So during the summer, when it's hot, it's also drier. So in most of our urban and suburban areas, we have lots of vertebrate pests that are very successful. Things you would find everywhere, deer, raccoons, squirrels, that sort of thing. Lawn pests like moles and pocket gophers really have a heyday because we've got moist soils. So one of our unintended consequences of a law that passed about 10 years ago to do with anti-trapping meant that we can't use any body gripping devices anymore. You can use a mouse trap, and that works fine against mice, but it doesn't help you at all against moles or pocket gophers. So that makes control pretty difficult for those pests. We do have a squirrel species. This is the Douglas squirrel. Actually, we have a lot of squirrel species that get into attics and that sort of roof crawl spaces, set up nests, and many of them are either endangered or protected. So treatment means you have to hire a company to come get them and release them somewhere else, because you're not allowed to just release them anywhere. So this is actually one of those that happened to me in my house, and had to hire a company that had a permit from the Department of Wildlife to come to come trap them. So in terms of best management practices, BMPs, not always being followed, I've included this picture over here of a tree that has an infestation of western tent caterpillar. That's a nest. A mechanical treatment that often makes headlines in our area because at least twice a year we hear about somebody who has been driven beyond the bounds of sanity, even though these are very sporadic pests. And the best management practice is to prune them out. Instead, they light the nest on fire, and sometimes they get the neighboring house on fire too. So how about biological controls? People really like the familiar. So what you're seeing in this picture is the campus of the University of Washington, which is right in the middle of Seattle. And these little specks here are goats. There's their home trailer right there. This is a big bank of Himalayan blackberry, which is a non-native huge problem in the Pacific Northwest. It's very common to see this sort of a thing in a public area. There's companies that rent out their goats. They basically come and show up for a week or however long you need to get to do their vegetation control business. Or you may find them in areas where there's very steep terrain, and when you start using mechanical controls, you get erosion. The problem with that is that if the soil gets into the water, it goes down into the sound. So an example in Seattle is that when on the very occasional times we have snow, it usually shuts the city down because we don't have snow removal equipment. And if we did, where would we put the snow anyway? Okay, so the discussion is, what do you use to put on the streets to help people drive around? Do you use salt or do you use sand? And people intuitively said, salt is a chemical. Salt, therefore, is going to be bad for the salmon because all chemicals are bad for the salmon, so definitely we should use sand. Okay, nobody looked into the scientific aspects of that, but they said, you know, that made intuitive sense, so they did it. And what they found out is that sand moves through the streams, gets into the stream beds, and it smothers the salmon eggs. So they went back and looked at the science and found, you know what, the amount of salt, the type of salt that you use really is not that bad for salmon. So sometimes you have to dig into the science and find out what is actually going to work. So that was just a little side thing because it has nothing to do with biological control. Okay, anyway, this picture I took right off of the web from the Williams-Sonoma website. Look at that little chicken tractor. Isn't that the cutest thing you can imagine? Also highly expensive, but I've seen ones exactly like that in the pricier Seattle neighborhoods because people really get a kick out of the notion that they're fertilizing their lawn and at the same time that the chickens are out there providing insect control. So again, it's a high emphasis on the familiar. It also ties in with the local food movement, which is really, really popular. The idea of everything being local, of knowing where it came from, of being chemical-free or organic. And the last photo is of my own cat. Even though she is restricted to the house, she caught a shrew, which somehow accidentally wandered into the garage when the door was open. Washington and Oregon both rank in the top 10 for states in terms of the highest percentage of pet owners. And lots of people will say that they have their pets, either cats to do rodent control or dogs to scare away raccoons or deer. But in fact, they really do not function well as biocontrols because they're indiscriminate. So let's go on to the pesticide end of things. And I've given you kind of a lot of information on this one because I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory arena because there's obviously a lot of rules related to pesticide use. To use certain products or use products in certain ways in these states, you have to have a license and proper categories. I'm not trying to insult Kansas or Missouri in any way. I'm not familiar with what your rules are. It's just that we're one of the more highly regulated states in the country, and so I usually find that I have to say that to begin with. So to hold your license, you have to have a certain number of recertification credits in a fixed period of time, or you have to retest. So Washington and Oregon both have about 12,000 pesticide license holders, and we have either 12 license types or 8 license types, and 29 categories or 18 categories. So if you work in weeds, diseases, or insects, then you've got at least 2 categories. If you work in rights of way, on public properties, so a single worker may have 4 or 5 different categories as well as a license. The USGS Geological Survey has done a lot of water quality studies around the country. So when we look at the ones in Washington and Oregon, we're looking basically for pesticides or their metabolites in surface water. That's really more the issue in urban areas, surface water instead of groundwater. So we've had detections in urban streams in the Seattle metro area and also in the Clackamas Basin in Oregon, and these are common lawn and garden pesticides. We're not talking ag materials here. So the worry for folks is that people are either using too much or they're not using it in the right way and the material's going into the waterway, and that impacts our salmon populations. So King County, which is where Seattle lies, has adopted rules for their own employees. All their county employees work in parks, rights of ways, others county properties, and they're only allowed to use materials from a least toxic list that's developed by the county. Thurston County, which houses Olympia, our state capital, their county employees are only allowed to use products based on a prescription. So to give you an idea of what the community thinks, there's 87 different community gardens just in the Seattle metro area, and they're mainly geared towards low-income gardeners. So they'll rent a space, and they'll either produce for themselves, they'll produce for a local food bank, they'll produce for a market stand or a CSA that's associated with that. And those community gardens are either restricted to organic products or designated as chemical-free. So lots of rules, whether they come from the federal, state, or the very local level. And lastly, there's several herbicides that either were used on lawns, could be used on lawns, or in grain crops to control weeds. And then the material is robust enough that composting does not change it. So the lawn clippings would go into the compost stream. The straw from the grain crops would go into straw bales, or it would be sent off to the compost stream. And then gardeners would buy that compost, plant it, and their seedlings would die. So that has really raised awareness among the public, but it's also made them feel very vulnerable because the applications take place out of their site. They don't know whether the material they're getting is contaminated or not, and so they feel threatened by that. And that translates into a lot of views about don't use pesticides at all because I can't tell if it has it or it doesn't. So what are some of the challenges that I see going on in terms of urban horticulture and pest management? And I think the biggest one that I see is that when you're looking at building a sustainable IPM system, that means you get it started and it kind of runs on its own as long as you're putting in, a moderate amount of inputs, is you have a high upfront cost. You've got to get the design of the site right. You've got to get the amendments right. You've got to get the plants right. And the professional evaluation to do all of that costs a lot of money. And so you're also then looking at monitoring costs and the labor costs of doing the mechanical types of controls, whether it's hand weeding or hand picking insects or whatever. And so that means that your sustainable landscapes are pretty much restricted to people that have a lot of disposable income. It also happens that the amount of knowledge that it takes to run a functioning IPM system, you're not going to have the trouble with that because you've got the knowledge, not only the basic knowledge, but you've had enough of the parts of the knowledge to know how to put it together, how to articulate an entire program as opposed to just one bit of knowledge here and one bit of knowledge there. So, for your average homeowner, trying to put all that stuff together is really hard without having any help. So they generally wait till there's a problem. They try to fix it at the lowest level. They resort to revenge spraying when that doesn't work. And then they go to a professional for help. So what's going to happen is you're going to get somebody who's absolutely desperate. And they want something done yesterday. And the challenge there is solving the problem at the lowest level that you can, and then trying to make a connection with this person and get them to start thinking about next year already. Okay, I'll fix your problem for you right now, and let's think about what we can do next year to prevent this problem. There's a lot more energy and effort, human energy and effort, that goes into IPM than lots of other things, and sometimes people are not willing to do that. And as the slide says, they tend to be more reactive than proactive. I also think that as we continue to expand the bounds of scientific knowledge, we'll find that some things that we thought were okay, I don't want to use the term safe because that's a value system, that's a value judgment. But let's just say that some things that we thought would not be a problem, as we learn to measure them better, sometimes we find they are a problem. So the example I'm thinking of is the neonicotinoid pesticide imidacloprid. Okay? And Meredith may discuss this in her presentation, so I don't want to go into too many more details about that, except to say that initially we thought, yay, we've got a pesticide that can be systemic. So you get it into the plant, and that means we're being really protective of bees instead of making a foliar application where they're going to be rubbing up against it, taking it back to the hive. Well, as it turns out, as we learn more about that, that may not necessarily be the case, that it is safe for bees. So we need to adapt as our knowledge base changes. Another challenge that we have is that we have to balance pest management with public safety. And if you think of wasp nests in schoolyards or parks, we do have people that have severe allergic reactions, and they have just as much right to have conversations about pesticide use and pest management practices as people who would prefer a chemical-free environment. And then lastly, as if all this stuff wasn't challenging enough, we also have to deal with changes in our climate. So weather means we have a change in our growing conditions, so our plant species will change. We have heavy rainfall events predicted, which means that we're going to get more flooding, which is going to call for more rain gardens, and care in designing our landscapes so that they can withstand this kind of pressure. Average temperatures have been rising in the Pacific Northwest, so whether a person actually believes in climate change or not, what we have to do is focus on the reality. We have warmer temperatures, and so we're going to have to deal with the outcome of that. So if it's warmer, we're automatically going to predict less snowpack, and that's our major source of fresh water. So if you decrease the stream flow in the summers because you have lower snowpack, this is also the same time you've got the higher temperatures, which means that we're going to be working with drought stresses. So we have to focus on getting more drought-tolerant landscapes out there. And from the pest angle, warmer winter temperatures means that your insects and diseases that previously did not live in that area now can. So they're either able to overwinter and you have permanent populations, or if the temperatures are warm enough, you can get another generation, which is going to cause you definitely more problems. So let's move on to maybe some of the more positive end of things. The Pacific Northwest has a lot of energy directed at beautiful landscapes. And the photo here comes from the Northwest Flower and Garden Show. This is an exhibit there. This is the largest garden show west of Philadelphia. So this particular exhibit has a natural vegetation roof. And so this would be what a Pacific Northwesterner would call an outdoor room. You just put on some fleece and go out there in the middle of the wintertime. What you can't see is that these plantings here are a mixture of ornamentals and edibles. That's a big issue now. Big energy level is to interplant edibles and ornamentals. So low impact development, I don't know if you practice that here. When I'm talking about development, I mean like a whole area, like a little urban village, where you're designing the housing areas, the parking areas, the sidewalks, everything. This is really a hot topic in our area, and the low impact part means that the asphalt and the concrete are permeable. So again, they serve as a filter. Also that it's got rain gardens strategically placed, and you have community gardens in the middle where people are able to grow their own vegetables. We also have lots of organizations that provide educational materials, everything from the university, where we're a big player in that, to the advocacy groups, which are also big players, as well as the public utilities. And naturally, we don't always agree on the best course of action on what people should be doing, but people are hungry for information, as long as it's in little bits, little sound bites, and it contains action items. What can I do today? Lots of pictures. So 56% of the Seattle residents that are 25 years or older, so they have the potential to be living on their own, 56% of them have a bachelor's degree, 23% of them have a graduate degree. So they're used to dealing with other professionals, with people that have some kind of degree or certificate or advanced training, so they're expecting to ask for credentials to see, do people have an IPM certificate besides having a license? Do they have advanced training in a particular area? They also want some data. So the pest management companies are very used to handing out written material that tells people something about the pest, something about the treatment, and something about the hazards of any chemicals that they're applying. One of the sources that we use for hazards is the National Pesticide Information Center. So I would recommend that to you if you're not familiar with it. It's paid out of a grant by EPA, and it's run by Oregon State University. So what I'd like to do now is turn the lights up so we can wake everybody up. And what I'm going to say is that if you want to ask some questions or you want to make some observations, shout them out. I put some questions up there just in case you want to have something to focus on as opposed to the top of your head. So I'll take the gentleman in the back first.
Well, IPM doesn't mean we can't use pesticides, because that's part of one of the control methods. And I like to tell people that in the whole field of medicine, they inject a tremendous amount of pesticides directly into our body. Every bactericide is antibiotic. And so I think that only part of the story is told on that. And as I listen to you, you're making some really good points, but I think there's information that isn't given also. When we deal with rain gardens in this community, every product is really a rain garden.
Yes.
There's a lot of pushback on it.
Yes.
So I shed with an organic living roof, that's a very high input structure, because it's concrete, steel reinforced. And all
Yes.
that. And if every home was built that way, it would take a tremendous amount of resources. And that story's not told. So just those are my thoughts.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was a gentleman here.
Well, I just had a question about the regulations. How easy is it for the public to inform the people who are regulating that if somebody's applying chemicals incorrectly? And does being a homeowner negate some of those regulations? You can put it down yourself type of thing?
Okay, that's a two-part, I'm going to break that into a two-part question in terms of if you see something as a homeowner that you think is not right, how is there a way to bring somebody's attention to that?
Do they know?
Yes.
That they can?
Yes. Well, that's a third question. Does a homeowner know? The answer to that question is by and large, no. Homeowners make things up all the time. It's just whatever seems to make sense to them, they do. And until I got into this job, I had the same attitude. It's only when you get into the field of pesticide regulation that you understand just how different and quirky it is. But in all of the states, if you as a homeowner see something and you don't think that it's right, you can call the compliance division at the Department of Agriculture. In those 3 states, they're the ones that are told by EPA you can act as our compliance officials and say, I have a complaint. They're required to investigate every complaint and find out, go through their checklist and determine does it have some merit and what can they do about that legally or otherwise. So yes, there have been cases where people say somebody sprayed my garden, and it'll turn out that when you install cameras and you watch, the neighbor next door will be spraying his, and then he'll go over like this. That's happened. So that part. The second is, what can you do on your own property? That's a very tricky thing. And generally, this is the rule the way I understand it. You can do whatever you want to on your own property as long as it affects nobody else. It affects nothing to do with the environment. It doesn't move off in the air. If you apply it to an edible crop, you do not sell, barter, or trade that crop or allow anybody else to eat it except you. Because if you poison yourself, okay, too bad. That's the way it goes. But you're not supposed to be doing anything that can affect anybody else in any way. Now, I think that's a dumb rule myself. Personally, I think you should be held accountable for doing things you ought not to. But, the world, according to Catherine, is never going to happen. So we'll just forget that part. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, the only reason why I ask is I'm in the industry, and when I first started in it, I saw things that I was finding out to be, like a guy spraying a field, and there's a playground of kids over here playing, and you can see the drift going that direction. And originally, I didn't know who to call, or where, and supposedly these are, in our area, we have to be licensed as well.
Right.
And they have to have upkeep and study and take tests, but you still see daily things done improperly, not cleaning off the sidewalks after applying, fertilizers and stuff like that. And to be honest with you, I've never heard until, going through this program, as a public, how to address those issues or even what to do.
Some things happen, and you can either handle them on an industry basis in the terms of make it a very strong ethic within your industry to approach the other professional and say, you need to clean this up because you're giving our industry a bad name. Some industries do that. What I've heard in some of the crop industries within Washington is when they know a bad player, they'll turn that player into the Department of Ag because that person is blackening all at their eyes. Okay, so it just depends on how individuals want to do that. But yes, there is a place that you can always go to and say something's going on. Lady in red.
In the areas of Johnson County with Overland Park and the city of Old Lake, contact planning and development, code compliance. You tell the address where it happened, and the company, if you can get the name of the company, the phone number, or the tag on the truck, and you can turn it in to the city of where you live.
Great, great. Did I see some other, yes, ma'am?
There are places to people to contact in Johnson County. I didn't catch who the.
Ma'am, could you say again the people to contact in Johnson County?
Planning and development, code compliance.
Planning and Development, Code Compliance.
Planning and development.
Yes, Code Compliance.
What's the last?
Planning and Development, Code Compliance.
Code compliance.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's me. I'm sorry. I know that you don't have a lot of time yet, but I'm in the regulatory end of things. And every year or every other year, there's this big pest of doom that's going to come and just change things. And right now, I'm concerned about the spotted wing Drosophila.
Yes.
And I don't know if that has been, like, is that on your guys' radar?
Yes.
What impact would that have? Because you guys are very organic. I know that the whole climate is this is going to be a very challenging pest. It's going to shut down a lot of organic companies.
Yes.
And the IPM end of things is just a nightmare.
Yes.
So I was wondering on the extension end of things, how you guys are working with that. This has to be a very proactive, controlled pest.
You know, we're
Scary pest.
we're-
I eat fruit and strawberries.
we're still wrapping our arms around how to do it. I mean, what usually happens when you get something new in is that you have no scientific basis for what to do. So you try a whole bunch of things, and that's how you gather data about usually what doesn't work. Hopefully, something will work. But spotted wing Drosophila, for those of you that don't know, it's you know, just like any other little fruit fly type thing, little tiny thing, except that most fruit flies will not damage unripened fruit. They damage the stuff that's overly ripe. A spotted wing Drosophila damages unripened fruit. So it'll sting and put its eggs into unripened fruit. So that as the fruit ripens, you open it up and it's all full of maggots. So that's what makes this a really difficult pest, because sanitation doesn't help you. Normally that's how you get rid of the other Drosophilas, is you practice good sanitation, no overly ripe fruit, and you don't have any problems. Can't do that with this one. Also because when they inject their egg into the fruit, a topical application is not going to help you either. You're talking about having to use systemic materials like malathion, for example. So yes, it's very worrisome to us, both at the commercial end and the homeowner end of it. We haven't found any natural crop resistance in terms of thickened skin that makes it too hard to inject the egg. We haven't found that. What we're trying to focus on is just holding down the population levels through some of these other chemicals, and trying to do monitoring, trying to find out, you know, who's got more of it than somebody else. But as a region, we're not even close to figuring out how to deal with this.
Because your winters are pretty mild, right? So.
Well, they're mild to begin with, and now they're getting even milder. So yeah, that's no help to us. Do you have a pest of, besides spotted wing Drosophila, do you have a pest of doom up here?
Well, I mean, we're always concerned about sudden oak death.
Yes.
We don't have that yet, but we do trace boards on that. I mean, I hate to say pest of doom, but.
It's
yeah.
a great description. I love that.
Yeah, well, because I do talks a lot, people are like, well, that was a little depressing. But, I mean, there's always optimism and hope, you know, the emerald ash borer. But there's good, positive, like Asian longhorn beetle, that is possible to get in there and get it out when it's found.
Right.
That can be a devastating pest. What's another one? There's I don't know, downy mildew, that's a mild one, but it gets systemic in roses. It's a nasty problem.
Yeah.
Not just in roses, there's so many.
Got ya.
Spotted wing Drosophila very much concerning.
Yes.
Because it affects our food production.
Yes.
I like organic.
Absolutely.